This lesson covers creating a clustered storage space using an external disk enclosure. In this lab environment, I have a 2-node cluster with nodes Sabdal Hyper-V 20 and Sabdal Hyper-V 21. Each of these nodes has a Dell SAS HBA, which is connected to a Dell external storage enclosure, a Dell MD1200. In that enclosure, I have 12 drives. 9 of them are 1 TB hard disk drives and 3 of them are 400 GB SSD drives. This will enable me to not only create a clustered storage space but also use tiering. Both of the boxes have connectivity to the same external storage enclosure so they can see the same disks. If I was to look at Disk Manager, I would see all of those disks as unallocated. If I had redundant connections, i.e. 2 connections from each box to the storage enclosure, I would need to make sure I install the MPIO feature and then run the MPIO installation and configuration so it removes the redundant view of the storage and understands I just have multiple paths to the same disks. Once my 2 nodes both have access to the storage enclosure, the next thing I want to do is actually download and install this hotfix, 2913766. This gives me improved manageability of storage enclosures on Windows Server 2012 R2. The first thing I'm actually going to do is via PowerShell. For example, I will actually go ahead and look at all my physical disks where the bus type is Serial Attached SCSI or SAS. Here you can see I can see those 12 disks. My 9 1 TB disks and then my 3 400 GB SSD drives. I can then check which drives can actually be part of a storage pool. So I'm checking it can pool is true. And what I should see is those same 12 disks available to me. Part of that hotfix, the 2913766, adds this get storage enclosure command. When I run this, it will show me the overall health of that storage enclosure. And I should see exactly the same content when I connect to the other node. So if I actually now remote desktop to the second box, this is now the second machine. If I paste, for example, looking at the disks, I see exactly the same 12 drives. If I also looked at the storage enclosure, because I have this hotfix installed on both my machines, I would again see the same storage enclosure available to me. So I'm looking at the same storage. The next step is to actually go ahead and create the clustered storage space. Now instead of using Server Manager, I'm actually going to use Failover Cluster Manager. And I'm going to go to Pools under the Storage node. I select New Storage Pool. I click Next to the New Storage Pool introduction screen of the wizard, and I give it a name. So for example, in this case, I'm just going to say Clustered Storage Pool. Notice it's being managed by the cluster, not either of the nodes. What I would do though, if I looked in Server Manager at this point, I would see I just have a primordial pool with all 12 of those disks in it available to the cluster. So I can do management through Server Manager as well. It's just better to use Cluster Manager. I can now select the disk and notice it shows me they are in that external enclosure. I will select to add all 12 of my disks. Click Next, and then click Create. This is now creating that clustered storage pool. I'm now going to select the Create a Virtual Disk when this wizard is closed. Again, this is basically using the Server Manager wizards just triggered through Failover Cluster Manager. And again, if I refresh this view now in Server Manager, I would now see I have that clustered storage space using the disks in external enclosure. So I can see that clustered storage pool is now present. This actually looks exactly the same. I select my pool, I give it a name, so clustered virtual disk. I can say I want to use storage tiers. I'll use mirroring. I can do a 2 or a 3-way mirror because I have 3 disks in each of the tiers at least. I have 3 in the SSD tier and 9 in the hard disk drive tier. I select the size from each of those tiers. For example, maybe I'll use 60 gigabytes from the SSD tier, and I'll use 2 terabytes from the hard disk drive tier. I see the confirmation. This is now creating that virtual disk in that storage space. The final step is to then actually create the volume. I'll leave this checked, so I'll actually go ahead and create this. Leave the default selected, so it's this new clustered virtual disk. The size is the maximum. I'm going to assign it a drive letter, file system, so maybe I'll call it clustered virtual disk. Check the details and click create. This will now create me a clustered disk that's available. I can now click close, and if I go to my disks, I'll now see my new cluster virtual disk as available storage. I can also make this a cluster shared volume by selecting add to cluster share volumes, and this will then appear in the standard cluster storage namespace. So as completed, I can see my refresh is my volume 8. And I would just write to this like anything else. So this is now an external storage enclosure that's available to all the nodes in the cluster. If I go to my other node and fire up Explorer, cluster shared volumes, remember, are accessible to all the nodes in the cluster concurrently. So both nodes that are connected to this storage enclosure can read and write simultaneously. So I now have a clustered storage space using tiering on that external disk enclosure.